welcome everybody. And I'm so glad we've had such a tremendous interest in tonight's discussion. I'm really happy to have everyone here. The way we're going to run tonight's program is more like a webinar because I want to talk a lot. So there you go. Just live with that. So if you have questions or comments, put them in the chat, and those will go to Rabbi James, who's going to organize them. So I'll stop periodically. We'll organize the questions and comments, and I'll be able to respond in an organized way. Guess what? In an hour and 15 minutes, we will not cover everything related to issues have to do with Israel and Palestine. We're really going to talk about my trip there, the elections, a little bit of my reflections, hopefully answer some questions and give more information and clear things up. And we have a lot of experts on this call, on this meeting. It's not really a call, right? This meeting, this gathering, this conversation. So a few things as for a hakdama, for an introduction. Everybody has very strong feelings when it comes to this topic. And then there's a lot of people who don't know what to feel. So we have people who have very, very strong feelings, and other people who don't know what to feel and are very confused because the news is very hard to understand. This, like a lot of complicated topics, takes a lot of knowledge and information. And as is famously said about the region, and somebody quoted this to me, which I've heard for years, everybody who goes to Israel or to Palestine or that general area, after a week they've been there, they're convinced they kind of write a book. If they stay a month, they think they can write an article. And if they stay for a year, they can't write anything. So there's something that is to be said for that in its own. You start out thinking, oh, I understand this. This is this, that is that, this is the blah, 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 blah. It's clear. And then you get to learn a little bit more and you talk to a few more people, whatever your political position. And it starts to get more and more murky. And that's part of the problem with these issues. So some of you have spent years with me talking about these issues, have traveled with me, have been in various classes and conversation. And you know I value confusion as a pathway to wisdom. So I am going to tell you about my most recent trip, which was at an extremely important and significant time in the history of the world, honestly, and the history of this tiny, tiny, tiny little place. And we're going to discuss some of these issues. Some people have asked that I consider teaching a longer class so that there can be some opportunity to go deeper, and we'll consider that. And of course, we had another Israel trip planned that we had to cancel because of COVID. So all these things are open, but we're thrilled to have Shari and Debbie, who are CBST members who live in Tel Aviv, are joining us. It's 7 hours later in Tel Aviv, so it is whatever time there. And some other folks from the region were going to join us. And I know many of you have been there and many of you have very strong ideas. And I also know there's a lot in our community and in the extended community who really don't know what to think. And so, and because of the strength of some people's ideas and the ideas and this energy behind both, not both, many different sides, a lot of people feel like they don't even want to stick their head out of the shell because they feel like the energy is so negative and so scary, they don't want to get involved. On top of that, anti-Semitism is exploding in our world, in our country, in the larger world. I certainly, in my 62 years, have never seen the level of anti-Semitism that we're experiencing now. And I think that's true for most people, except if you have lived in certain locations like the former Soviet Union and some other locations. So certainly in my lifetime, and I'm a Jewish historian and I love Judaism and I study things, I've never experienced the kind of anti-Semitism we are experiencing. So I think that framework of anti-Semitism makes talking about some of these topics and issues even scarier because some of the issues are being used by anti-Semites for an agenda of anti-Semitism. So it means that we have to be able to separate enough, or at least to understand that framework, to talk about some of the issues, knowing that some people use some of these things in anti-Semitic ways. But just discussing them, I do not think is anti-Semitic. So let's go to the travelogue part of the trip. First of all, Randy and I decided while the war, the conflict, the violence, whatever word you want to use, was going on with Gaza, that we wanted to go there. I like to go to Israel when it's in profound trouble. Some of you have gone with me on trips. We went during the first Intifada, we went during the second Intifada, and I've always joked we get the best hotel rates then because nobody else is going. We didn't manage to get to Israel until there was a ceasefire for various logistical reasons. And I'll tell you why it's so important for me to go to Israel in general and in difficult times specifically. My experience is that the right-wing American Jewish community knows what it is to be in solidarity with Israel, shows up both in physical presence and in money. And the progressive center-left in American Jewish life doesn't do the same thing. So what happened is that those people inside of Israel and in Palestine or the Palestinian territories feel abandoned. It's emotional. They feel like here they are trying on the ground to make a difference, and they watch the right wing pouring literally billions of dollars into right wing causes in Israel. I'll give you an example. As one of the people who was just elected to Knesset, their TV ad was all about how gay people are the new Holocaust killing Jews. That political party gets funded in part by right-wing Jewish money. I'm not making this up. Somebody just showed me, I just saw the ad that goes through the Holocaust, goes through other anti-Semitic things and says, reform Jews and gay people who are destroying the Israeli Jewish family. We gay people, we're depressing the birth rate in Israel. That's an example of a political ad of a party running for government now in Israel. Those people are getting money from the right wing. The progressive part of Israel, who is trying to build a just and democratic state of Israel, where people are treated justly and where Palestinian issues are dealt with honesty and partnership, the left is just, the loud part of the left is boycotting Israel, and then the quiet part of the left is not really supporting them in a big way. So we have this huge imbalance between what right-wing American Jews do about Israel and what progressive American Jews do about Israel, and it has a huge impact. So I wanted to go really to give a lot of friends a hug, to see our CBST members who live in Israel. I met with all different kinds of groups, and I'm going to go through that now, from Hagit Ofran, who some of you know, a fabulous lesbian in Jerusalem who runs the Settlement Watch for Peace Now, and Yonatan Ger, who's a CBST member who runs Combatants for Peace, Shari and Debbie. We met with people from the Histadrut, which is the main organization which runs all the workers and labor unions in Israel. But we're going to do a little slideshow. Consider this the travelogue nobody's been able to have. Remember when you used to go to somebody's house and they showed terrible slideshows of their trips? But now nobody gets to go on a trip, but we did. So we went. So first thing is that it's very difficult to get into Israel right now. Because of the virus, you have to get an entry permit to even get on a plane in New York or anywhere to fly to Israel. You have to prove you've been vaccinated, and you have to prove you're negative for the virus just to get on a plane. To get the entry permit, we had to ask Meirav Michaeli, who's spoken at CBST and is a good friend, and she's a member of the Knesset, and now she's the head of the Labor Party of the Knesset. She had to write a letter to the ministry of the blah, 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 whatever ministry it was, saying she needed to meet with us in person rather than on Zoom. We needed that letter in order to get the entry permit to get in. When we landed in Ben Gurion, this is what the airport in Israel looks like. It's empty. The only people who were there was our flight. And next slide. And everybody on the flight had to go for a COVID test immediately upon landing in Israel. Every single person has to get a COVID test on landing in Israel. And you'll see, for those of you who read Hebrew, they don't call it COVID in Hebrew, they call it Corona. It's a very interesting how did we ended up calling it COVID and they call it Corona? That's somebody's PhD thesis one day. Anyway, every single person from the plane has to go get a COVID test. Next slide. So there we are getting a COVID test. It's set up very fast. Guess what? You can organize things so that every single person gets a COVID test that lands. Every plane is met. A COVID test in order to leave the airport. It was a rapid test, but we don't get the results for a couple of hours. You're supposed to stay quarantined. We then went to our hotel where we had to have a serology test, an antigen test, so that our blood was tested to see that we had antigens. They don't trust the US little vaccine card that shows that I've been vaccinated. They don't trust US government documents. Very interesting. So we had to be tested in this way, and then we had to get a test again in the hotel and stay in the hotel until we got the results from the antigen test. So that's just one thing. In Israel, the issue about Corona, COVID is a public health issue, right? And you don't hear a right-wing politician say, I'm not going to wear a mask or I'm not going to get the vaccine. They cannot believe in Israel, they cannot believe that it's a political issue here in America. And we're talking, there are a lot of very, very, very right-wing people there. The only people who are the anti-vaxxers, so to speak, is there's a small part of the Haredi population there, like here, who won't get vaccinated. 1% of the Haredi population in Israel died from COVID. That's a pretty significant number. I wonder if it's the same here. 1% died. And it really ravaged the community there. So other than that, and in some of the Arab towns, there's not been 100% compliance. Similar Israeli Arab towns, similar to issues that some African Americans have of questioning whether they can trust the government vaccine. But Israeli Jews are pretty much at the herd immunity number, whatever that is. And once you go through all these tests, while we were there, every Israeli has on their cell phone a green pass, if they're fully vaccinated, to get into the hotel for meetings with us. Every Israeli we met with had to show there's a security person outside in front of the hotel, and you have to show that green pass to even walk into the lobby. Guess what? They have conquered, Corona for now. One of the big questions that you hear about is what about the virus, the vaccine getting to the West Bank and Gaza? This is a really complicated situation because the West Bank has a minister of health, and they would not officially accept vaccine from Israel because they don't trust it. And a Palestinian on the West Bank is not very likely to take the vaccine if they got it from Israel. And technically, they have a Ministry of Health that technically is responsible for health. However, many people I spoke to said there are all different ways for Israel to get the vaccine to the West Bank and to Gaza were the political will to be there. And now with this new government, and we'll get to that situation, we think that will happen. But that's about Corona. One of the jokes that was going around Israel while I was there is that in the time that the rest of the world is still dealing with one crisis, meaning the COVID crisis, Israel has gone on to have 4 major crises since COVID, and the rest of the world is still deep in COVID. What are those 4 crises that Israel has gone through since they've conquered COVID? The first was the terrible trampling of Haredim in Mount Meron in the north of Israel when they were there for the observance of Lag BaOmer. The second was the war between Hamas and Israel, Gaza and Israel. The third is the explosion of violence in mixed Arab Jewish cities. And the fourth is this election balagan that is the unending Groundhog Day-like experience of Israelis. This was the 4th election in 2 years. There has not been a functioning government in Israel for 2 years. Just take that in for a second. People are so, I'm not even sure what the right word is. So, okay, keep going, Jason, next slide. So I had to put this in. It's not the best kanafe I've had by far, but those who were on the trip with me, with our families with kids trip, we spent a lot of our trip to Israel searching for the best kanafe. So I just wanted to prove that I did have kanafe while I was in Israel. For those of you who have been with me before, it's a Palestinian delicacy That's the city in which it's the best, according to Palestinians, is the city of Nablus, which is in the northern part of the West Bank. And I've had kanafe there. It's really fantastic. But you can get kanafe all over, especially in Palestinian communities. It's a cheesy, sweet dessert that's a huge Palestinian delicacy. I just want to prove to the people who were on the trip with me, I did have kanafe. It wasn't as good as the kanafe we had. But okay, next, that's not a political slide. Here we are, we're walking through Jerusalem. For those of you who know and love Jerusalem, this is a very funny, very famous fountain. Again, this is not a political side, just to show that we walked through Jerusalem. For those of you who love Jerusalem, you'll recognize some images. I love this. It's a great, what do you call it, fountain with the animals. Next one. This is the YMCA in the center of Jerusalem. That houses so many wonderful activities. And I think with some of the trips, we've been there for dinner. It has a wonderful cafe, which is closed right now. And it has this wonderful saying on the front. And it has a pool and a gym, and it has a chorus, a Jewish Arab children's chorus. That's wonderful. Next slide. And we went there to meet Renee Gutmann, whom many of you know, who's been the CBST tour guide for almost every trip. Next slide, Jason. This was a graffiti we saw walking up to the IMCA, actually, it's the YMCA. So I wanted to give you some texture of what Jerusalem looks like. Also from Jerusalem, very famous for those of you who know the German colony in Baca. Next. This is Renee Gutmann, who many of you know, and we are wearing there every Saturday night. These slides got a little out of order, it's fine. Every Saturday night, there's been a demonstration against Bibi Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, at his home, which is in Jerusalem on Balfour Street. So in front of his home, there's a demonstration every single Saturday night by crowds and thousands of people. And everybody, to get into the demonstration, you wear this little sticker, and it says Guardians of Democracy. The anger towards Bibi is extreme, and in his attempt to stay in office, and what his goal has been, he has been extremely cynical and manipulative. And his goal has been to undermine and destroy the very instruments of democracy. He's now been working on destroying the court system, which has been independent. And he has destroyed all different organizations. Think of what Trump was doing to the United States government, and had Bibi has now been in office for 12 consecutive years, I think. And then before that, he was out for a few years, and then he was in. So over the last 18, 19, 20 years, Bibi has been a presence. And imagine our having Trump all those years, the amount of damage done to the institutions. That's exactly what Bibi has done. So every Saturday night, there's this demonstration just against Bibi. So keep going. I just want to show you some images from that demonstration. This is Anat Hoffman, who is the president of the Israel Religious Action Center. Keep going also at that demonstration. So some of the signs from the demonstration, a unity government now, keep going. I'm just going to show you just images, make values great again. Folks that some of you might recognize at the demonstration that we saw. This says, bye bye Bibi, bye Bibi, bye bye. This says, we are the hope. Keep going. This is a beautiful rewriting of the prayer for peace. And it says that we need a change of government, and we need to have a future of peace, of shared partnership. Keep going. I'm not going to translate the whole thing now, but these are just, I took shots of different signs, just so you get a set. Crime Minister is one of the major signs about Bibi. He's called, instead of Prime Minister, Crime Minister. He is actually on trial right now, 3 days a week. His trial is being heard in the courts. He's under trial for major corruption. Keep going. This is one of my favorite signs. This guy says, it will be good, it will be better, it will be fine. And then in the smaller letters, it says, until then, we are here. I love that sign. Keep going. We visited the Hand in Hand School, which is a system of schools around the country, which are Arab and Jewish children from K through 12. And they're largely found in mixed cities or in areas of mixed Jewish Arab populations. And we met with the principal and the vice principal of the school. Every classroom has an Arab and a Jew in the classroom, and it's bilingual Hebrew and Arabic. That is a very radical thing in Israel, even though Arabic is supposed to be a formal language there. And so we met with teachers and administrators and students in our visit. We didn't take pictures of the students, but this woman is the vice principal. And we asked her what it was like during the whole time with Gaza. How was it coming to school, leaving her village in East Jerusalem, traveling to the school and being with Jews, and how did they manage? The school was closed for some days, but it's really, really hard work. And this is a community that's dedicated. They have to listen to each other's anger and listen to each other's fear. It's not a Pollyanna, la place. These people work really hard. And when we asked the kids the same question, they said, listen, we have classes every week in dialogue, how to even just talk to each other. So that when things are really hard, we've already had a lot of experience in practicing saying difficult things and listening to difficult things. Next slide. And these are different sayings that were through the school. Next, I don't want to get too lost in the school. Also from the school, walking around the school building. On the left, this is Donnie Elazar, who is he's in charge of the whole system. And the woman on the right is the principal of the school in Jerusalem. This is Noah Yammer, who went to my high school. She and I love to say we are the two graduates of Frisch Yeshiva High School that the school is the most ashamed of. And now Noah works full-time at the Yad B'Yad school. So she and I always share this as our identity. She graduated, by the way, how shall we say, a lot later than I did. Here we are one of the days, and there's Shari and Debbie. We took a trip to the south. We went to what's called the Gaza Envelope in Hebrew. And the Gaza Envelope means the area that surrounds Gaza. Actually, I should have done a slide of the map. So that Gaza is on the coast. And we went to one of my favorite places. All the trips to Israel go with me when we can, to Nativ HaAsara, which is a moshav on the northern part of Gaza. What you are looking at here behind my back is Gaza. You are looking into Gaza. That's how close this moshav is. We're on an overlook here, which, by the way, this overlook didn't exist when the last trip went. And we met with this extraordinary woman, Rani Kedar, who's speaking at this moment. This moshav originally was in the northern part of the Sinai as part of the Yamit settlements, which were 11 settlements that were placed in the northern part of Sinai after the 6-day war. And when the peace agreement was signed between Sadat and Egypt, part of the peace agreement was that those 11 villages had to be evacuated and the people moved out of that area and back into Israel. And as she said to us, she's a peace activist. She supported peace, but why did peace require her to move? Why couldn't she stay? Why couldn't her village stay as part of Egypt or part of some kind of, it was a narrow strip between what would have been Egypt, but that wasn't to be. So she told us this remarkable story. So the whole village basically moved north. They were offered to move into Gaza. They did not want to move into another disputed area. And so they moved just north of Gaza. Her husband was one of the most famous agricultural experts in desert agriculture. And so living in the northern part of Gaza is where he learned his trade, so to speak. And as a scientist, he developed all the tools to manage. So they moved to this moshav. They created a moshav with the money that they got from the government and created a moshav there just to the north of Gaza. And as she described it, for many years, going in and out of Gaza was a normal part of their lives, including when they lived in Yamit or Nativ HaAsara in the Sinai. She said she learned to drive in Gaza. They did all their shopping in Gaza. It was totally normal for Gazans to come and work or come into their village. There was completely complete access back and forth. And this changed when it changed about 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. And so she described the story. Let me go back. So after the peace agreement, they agreed to move because they wanted peace so much. And after the peace agreement, the government asked her husband to go to Cairo to be an agricultural consultant to the Egyptian government. And at first they said no. He was Egyptian himself. And in 1956, he had to flee Egypt. And then he had to leave Egypt. He had to leave. So he said twice in his life, he's had to leave, once because of war and once because of peace. But he and his wife, she said, they talked about it. And they said, if a peace agreement is going to mean anything, it's got to mean something more than a piece of paper that politicians signed. So he went for a year and then brought his whole family, Ronnie and their 5 children, to Cairo, where they lived for 5 years. And she said in the time she was in Egypt was transformative for her, that she grew up as kind of a run-of-the-mill Zionist, where she believed the story that Jews had exclusive right to the land, and anybody who was challenging that, was in the wrong. And she had her story and her narrative about what it meant to be an Israeli, what it means to be a Jew. She herself is from London. She kept saying, what am I doing? A nice girl from London, on an agricultural community in the desert. And she said, over time of those 5 years, she started to understand that other people had a different narrative than the narrative she had. And she would say, well, what about this? And they would have a different story for the same exact time and the same exact story that she thought she understood everything about it. And then she came to a point in her life where she realized that it was possible that at all these moments in history in which she was sure she understood what an event meant, there was another people who had a different understanding of what the exact same event meant. And she came to understand, not that her understanding was wrong, but that there were 2 stories, that there were 2 narratives, that if she was going to be the kind of human being she wanted to be, she had to understand that another people had a different narrative and that she had to listen to that narrative. And from that, she started to understand also that if there is going to be a future, there has to be a future in which 2 people share a land, even with different understandings. And she said, look, we can argue back and forth about what happened this year, what happened that year, but what is the future? The future is going to be these 2 peoples figuring out how to share this land. And she said to us, 1 state, 2 state, that's not the issue. The issue is, are we going to come to a place where we understand? And then she quoted, this land is your land. This land is my land. This land was made for you and me. This is a woman who lives on the border with Gaza. This is a woman who lives for the last 15 years in constant terror of those rockets. And she said during these 11 days of the war with Gaza, as rockets were coming in, and by the way, when a siren goes off, and when you see how close Gaza is, I mean, we're telling you, Shari and Debbie can confirm, I'm not exaggerating. We could see into Gaza. We could see the buildings there. We could see we could see the sea. If this were a better resolution, you could see the Mediterranean Sea on the other side of Gaza. She said, as I stayed inside my Ma'amad, her fortified room, and she heard the rockets, they have 15 seconds to get to a shelter when the siren goes off. She could also hear the bombs dropping in Gaza. At the same time that she heard the rockets flying over, and 90% got intercepted, thank God, by Iron Dome. She could also hear the bombs and the Israeli airplanes dropping bombs on Gaza. And she said, I sat in this Ma'amad texting with my friends in Gaza and being terrified for my family here in Netiv HaSarah. She said, this is not going to get solved by who's going to bomb the bigger bombs and who's going to explode more. She said, can you imagine what this region would look like if we had an understanding of a shared future? What kind of business and economy we could have? So that was a very powerful visit to the border of Gaza, and a very powerful woman. And by the way, I recommend following her on Facebook and also giving money to an organization that she's part of called Women Make Peace. It's women, many women who are right on the border, both inside of Gaza and inside of Israel, who are dedicated to finding a shared future. Her name is Rani Keidar, Keidar, and she's an extraordinary woman. Part of what I want to offer, and part of when I go to Israel, I want to meet the people who still believe in a vision of hope and are not just crushed by, oh, that's just kumbaya. What we have to do is we need bigger rockets, we need bigger guns. She understands what we know, that Hamas is not going to be the solution for the Palestinians either. We visited, these are two businessmen in East Jerusalem. The one with the striped shirt owns the Ambassador Hotel, which is in Sheikh Jarrah. And the man to his left is the head of the Palestine Bank. They're businessmen. They want peace. They want peace. They want to be able to make money, have business. The one with the striped shirt has a very, very famous tour company in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank. He wants to run his buses. He wants to have his hotels filled. And he owns 10 acres of land in Sheikh Jarrah that the Israeli government just confiscated 8 acres. Then he went back and he said, let me build a public area. No, they've confiscated the land from him and they'll give it to Israeli settlers. This is a guy that all he wants peace, because he knows that war is bad for business. And he wants to find a way to create a society in which Israelis and Arabs and Palestinians live decently and live with security and live with justice. He's not interested in being treated the way he is being treated by the Israeli government when he wants to build a new hotel and can't, because the land is going to go to Israeli settlers who insist it has to be only for Jews. Anyway, if you want more about that, we'll talk more, but very interesting conversation. This is in the patio, the outside area of his hotel in Sheikh Jarrah. More about Sheikh Jarrah in a minute. Do you have more of those pictures, Jason?
That's the final picture.
Okay, what? Oh, you didn't get the other pictures from Sheikh Jarrah?
That's the final picture in the slideshow.
I sent more pictures. Okay, so you didn't get them. Okay. So let me just talk a minute about Sheikh Jarrah. So what happened to cause what happened in Gaza in this most recent round? And then we'll go to the elections itself. There were a whole series of events that have happened, and we have, there's a whole thing of how much history do you need to know to unpack things, and how much contemporary things, and how do you go forward in life itself. But it is how shall we say, a tinder, what is that called? It's a fire waiting to happen. And various kinds of explosive materials can be put on it, which can increase the possibility for eruption. Hamas is a terrorist organization, which is not looking out for the best interests of its people. And it is also looking to defeat the Palestinian Authority as the voice of the Palestinian people. The Palestinians traditionally were secular. They were not Islamists. They were not radical Islamists by any means. And the Palestinian Authority itself was a very secular organization, but completely ineffective in delivering anything to its people. Along comes Hamas, which is a terrorist organization and uses violence as its tool, and it gets punished. And it gets results for its people, not great results from our perspective, but from their perspective. That's why Hamas won that election, is because Hamas was able to demonstrate to the people of Gaza that because of the violence that they advocated, Israel unilaterally evacuated, as opposed to the Palestinian Authority, which was about negotiation. So that's a very interesting dynamic that exists. So right before, during Ramadan itself, Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem. There are many, 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 many villages that are on, they're not all, by the way, on east of Jerusalem. The phrase East Jerusalem is more of a concept. It's not all east of Jerusalem. Some are south, some are north, but they kind of go around Jerusalem. These are Arab villages that existed before 1967 as part of Jordan and as separate villages. After 67, Israel annexed that area, the East Jerusalem, and made it part of Israel, but did not give voting rights for national elections to the Palestinians who lived in East Jerusalem, but made East Jerusalem part of Israel, but gave them the right to vote in municipal elections, kind of like Washington, D.C. You know, imagine you could vote for the local stuff, but you can't vote for the national. The Palestinians, by and large, don't vote in the municipal elections because they're so angry in East Jerusalem. Sheikh Jarrah is one of these neighborhoods. And there is a fierce movement on the part of the settlers, which, by the way, 70% of Israeli Jews do not support the settlement movement. This is something that American Jews, by and large, don't know. But a lot of Israeli Jews kind of, what can you do, so to speak? So the settler movement, the right-wing part of the settler movement, not the settlements that are there for economic reason, but the right-wing religious, often settlement movements believe that they are, that part of what they have to do is to create Jewish, what do you call it? You know, Jewish holds in these areas that are typically have been Muslim. The issue about Sheikh Jarrah is complicated only because of legal issues that are a little wackadoodle. But legally, the Israeli government has the right to evict people from Sheikh Jarrah because of laws that were established after 1967, which meant that if there were properties that had been part of Jordan from 48 to 67 that had been Jewish before 48, the Israeli government or Jews could get that property back. However, that kind of law doesn't exist for Palestinians who had property that they lost in 1948. That's why it's unfair. But when you hear them say it's just a real estate dispute, that's not really a fair way to talk about it. Although it is a real estate dispute because there's a law on the books. The problem is the law itself is discriminatory. So it makes it very complicated when this case comes in front of the Israeli Supreme Court for a judge to adjudicate this case. If they follow the law, the property will be taken from these Palestinian families who have lived there since 48 and given to Jews because the Israeli law makes that possible. That's why this is so explosive. And it's been winding its way through the courts. I don't remember the number of properties that have already been taken. But every Friday afternoon, there's a demonstration in Sheikh Jarrah. Rabbi James and I both, never together, interestingly, at different times of our lives, spent every Friday afternoon. It's the only major demonstration that's both Arabs and Jews in a demonstration together in East Jerusalem. And you see everybody. It's the place to see everybody. And every Friday afternoon, because it's Juma, people go there to protest because it's pretty horrific. So settlers, for instance, they've been able to legally get into half a house. So they move in these young, super obnoxious men into half the house. They hang huge Israeli flags and they blast loud Jewish music with enormous speakers right into the other half of the house to get rid of the Palestinians who live there and have lived there since 1948. So during this time, the Kahanist member of the Knesset, who, by the way, would never have gotten into the Knesset had it not been for Bibi Netanyahu, set up his office in Sheikh Jarrah. Let me try and find an equivalent for an American to understand what this would be like. Oh, I don't know. Imagine somebody who's in a Ku Klux Klan hood setting up an outside office in Harlem or in South Carolina in a neighborhood that's all Black people. I mean, I can't describe to you enough. This guy, Menachem Begin, wouldn't let these Kahanis into the Knesset. He got like 10,000 votes 2 elections ago. You have to get 120,000 votes to get into the Knesset. Nobody in Israel really supports him in big numbers, but Bibi raised him up because Bibi understood in order to stay in power, he needed to go to the right wing to get political power. So this guy sets up an outdoor office right in the middle of Sheikh Jarrah. Okay, that's issue number 2. And issue number 3, as some of you know, there were complaints made that Palestinians were throwing rocks down on people who were praying in the Jewish section of the Kotel. So Israeli police went to the dome of the Rock and to the El Aqsa Mosque, and they said they had intelligence that there were terrorists inside the mosque. So on Ramadan, on the 3rd Friday of Ramadan, which is one of the holiest days of the year, they went into the mosque with their boots on, which is, anybody knows about Muslim culture, to go into a mosque with your shoes on, even if you're a civilian, is considered disrespectful. And were very, very aggressive inside the mosque. The visuals of that image went all over the Muslim world. So Hamas really thinks, okay, this is a way we can show we are the defenders of the Palestinian people, and they start shooting rockets toward Jerusalem. It's not close, by the way. I mean, in American terms, it's all close because it's such a tiny, tiny, tiny place. But in Israeli terms, shooting rockets towards Jerusalem, that doesn't usually happen. Honestly, the people who live in the Gaza envelope feel abandoned by the Israeli government because they get rockets all the time. And they get these balloons that bring explosive fire things to drop into fields and burn up the fields. Anyway, so we know what happened. 11 days, this was just about when the government was going to get formed. That was another thing. And so people were suspicious that Bibi kind of helped to inflame this in order to prevent a government which was against Bibi being formed. So 11 days later, there's a ceasefire. Okay, I'm going to stop now. Rabbi James?
I want to pause for 1 minute just to say, we've been watching the questions come in.
Sorry.
So first of all, Jason has just posted in the chat the link to Roni Kedar to follow on Facebook, to the organization Women Wage Peace and their website, and also to the Hand in Hand School page. And I have to say, when Hand in Hand School, when you open the page, the first thing that comes up is the shared statement that they created together about how they're responding in their communities.
And by the way, when Obama had one of his Hanukkah parties, the Hand in Hand School was invited to light the menorah, and they brought a menorah to, you might remember this, it was very moving. We saw that they brought a menorah that the Palestinian kids and the Jewish kids made together, and a Palestinian kid and a Jewish kid lit the menorah. Matt Nosenchuk, are you in this Zoom? Remember, I'm sure he arranged it. Anyway, the other thing to put on is the Peace Now and Chagit Ofran. Could you put Peace? So Peace Now Settlement Watch is the best organization to watch this. We did a tour with Peace Now Settlement Watch. So there's some fantastic groups. This is the thing, is in Israel, there are fantastic groups in Jewish society that are fighting for a shared society. The idea that they are being starved to death because people aren't supporting them just breaks my heart. Rabbi Noah Satat, who many of you know, took us to the Knesset, and we spent a day in the Knesset. So now I'm going to talk about the Israeli government. And the Israel Religious Action Center has an anti-racism focus, that what they do within Israeli society is to focus on the racism. That's the Reform Movement's social justice arm. Are there any, should I pause now for any other questions, Rabbi James, or comments?
Sure. There's just a few technical ones, and then so one is, when will the next trip with CBST to Israel be? Which I'm
waiting till this virus is over so we could figure out. Yeah, we don't know yet.
It's okay. The Kanafa will wait, I promise. There's a question about about a little more about the detail of Sheikh Jarrah, because someone has read in right-wing press that basically the Arabs have been squatting in Sheikh Jarrah for 40 years, or did they pay for the real estate, and wanted to know about some clarification on the
So there's a lot of discussion about that. We don't really know that they knew that they had these new owners after 67 and how that works out. But ultimately, the issue is this question of there's a law that exists that allows Palestinians who are living in homes that were once inhabited by Jews, they have to give up those homes, and Jews who live in homes that were once Palestinian don't have to do that. Ultimately, that's where the conflict, yes, and there's a lot of debate about, did they pay rent to the right place? Who owns it? Because there are issues about who's the actual owner. But I got a very long briefing on this, and I'm giving you these are the highlights. But Hagit is the expert on this, and if we are really interested, we could bring her on Zoom and have her do the really deep dive in Sheikh Jarrah. But it is a symbol now in Palestinian society of the injustice of Israeli law towards Palestinians. And even as I said, this Palestinian businessman who owns this hotel, even he's affected by these laws about, in East Jerusalem, Palestinians will tell you, and Israeli Jewish activists, that the laws are all designed to empty East Jerusalem of Palestinians. So other laws exist. For instance, if you leave East Jerusalem, you're only allowed to stay there if you have a residency permit if you're a Palestinian in East Jerusalem. And your residency permit has to be approved by the Israeli government, of course. And if you leave East Jerusalem, you cannot renew your residency. So let's say you go to America to go to college. You don't have an Israeli passport, by the way. Israel annexed the territory, but did not give full citizenship to the people who live there. And this isn't even the West Bank, by the way. That's a whole different issue. But the Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem have to use that, what's that French word for the laissez-passer, which is a document to travel, but it's not a passport. When they come back from studying, at NYU, they can't move back to East Jerusalem. And let's say an East Jerusalem person marries a Palestinian from the West Bank. That Palestinian from the West Bank cannot get a residency permit. And it's all about trying to get Palestinians to move out of East Jerusalem. So it's virtually impossible to get a new residency permit. And it's almost virtually impossible to get a building permit if you want to build anything as a Palestinian. Those things are not true, of course, if you're a settler and you want to live in East Jerusalem, or a settler and want to live in the West Bank. It's one of the deep wounds that exist. Okay, let's go to the government issue. What happened with this election? And what is happening with the election? And I don't know, Shari and Debbie, you might have to update me. It changes every minute. So can we look at that slide? So first of all, everybody needs to know there are 120 seats. There are 120 seats in the Israeli Knesset, or parliament, which is based on the 120 seats that were in the Talmudic Sanhedrin. So 120 is a significant number. So of course, in order to have a government, you have to have at least 61, what they call mandates, or 61 seats. Does everyone get that? This is kind of basic. It's so different than American politics, it can be difficult to understand. This last election, because anybody could form a party, there were 70, that's right, 70 parties running in the election. It's insane. 13 parties, I think, 13 parties got enough to enter the government. What is enough? It means you have to get 3.25% of the population, of the number of voters, and it's a federal number, to get into the government. Each party has a list, and depending on how many mandates you get, determines how many seats you get into the government. So think of this, if you need 61 to run a government, nobody is getting, look, Likud here got 30, Yesh Atid got 17. So once you're there, you need to add up other parties to get to the 61. And I'm going to show you why this and how this was so difficult to do. So this is the fourth election. And in these other three elections, they were not successful in forming a government. So there's a whole process by which the government then falls apart and they have to call a new election. So on the left, where you see Halikud, Shas, Yamina, those are the center right parties. And on the Yesh Atid list, those are the center-left parties. Everybody see that? It's really important. The numbers next to each party indicate how many mandates each of those parties got. So you can see, if we were to have a strictly center-left government with no right-wing elements in the government, 56 mandates. That's not enough for a government. Next slide. If there were just going to be a right-wing government, right now with what the election resulted in, there would be 59 mandates. That's why Bibi thought he had the government for a while, because it looked like, and I'll show you what, that he had gotten to the 61, but it didn't happen. So so Bibi was left with 59. That was the situation after the election. So the president of there's a new president, but at the time, Rivlin, who was the president, looks at this list, decides who's most likely to form a government, and he handed the opportunity to form a government to Yair Lapid, who is the head of the party called Yesh Atid, who you see up there has 17 mandates. So Yesh Atid put together a government. I'm not sure if the next slide has, what's my next slide? Oh, no, don't have that. So Yesh Atid put together, go back to the left-wing government. Oh, no, actually, yeah, the center left. So what Yair, no, this one, leave the center left. So you see with center left, he has 56 mandates. So he has to get 5 to get to the magic 61. But 61 is still shaky. It's like the US, what a vote is, but still with 61, Yair Lapid would get to have a government, he would get to be a prime minister, and the government would be a center-left government. But over these last weeks, he did some pretty masterful negotiating. But if he couldn't have gotten 5 more seats, the government would have fallen and we'd be facing election number 5, which is exactly what happened right before Hamas rocket started. The government, they had a shaky combination, but people pulled out, so there was no government. After the ceasefire, Lapid went back to work, and what he did is that you see the party that says Yamina with 7 mandates? That's led by a guy named Naftali Bennett, who had been Bibi Netanyahu's chief of staff. So, but he is like, think of him like Romney versus Trump. He is right-wing, super anti-gay, super anti-solving the problems with the Palestinians. However, he hates Bibi and he does not like the way Bibi is acting. And so he, with seven mandates, negotiated with Yesh Atid that he would join the center-left party to get rid of Bibi if he could be prime minister. So we have a situation where the person who will be possibly the next prime minister of the state of Israel is the head of a government with 7 mandates. That's tiny, but he had that kind of power because Yair Lapid needed him. Then Yair Lapid went to Ram, which is the Islamist party. There are 4 Arab parties in the Israeli political system. Ram is the most right-wing of the 4 parties. It's an Islamist party. The Arab bloc broke apart. The Arab bloc, in the last time there was a government, had a lot of mandates because all 4 of these parties were able to come together. A bill came up in the Knesset outlawing conversion therapy for gay people, and 3 of the parties voted for that bill. But the Islamists are anti-gay, so they didn't want to vote against conversion therapy. So the Arab bloc fell apart, which was really unfortunate. And Ram, the Islamist party, was on its own. And Ram was willing to go into the government with Yesh Atid. So you have to imagine Yamina with those 7 and Ram with those 5. Move them over to the column. It can no longer be called a center-left government because now it's a government that goes from far right in many ways to far left is now the government. So those 2 parties move over to and then all of a sudden, Yair Lapid can form a government. Last Wednesday at midnight was the last time. There's the last minute of the amount of time that Yair Lapid had to form a government, and he, as of Wednesday morning, the government had fallen apart. All day on Wednesday, they were negotiating because Ayelet Shaked, who's a right-wing minister of the Yamina party, wanted more power. So they had to negotiate with her till 11:33 p.m. They finally presented a government to the president as of 11:33 p.m. with a midnight deadline. Noah Satat, who many of you know, told me she was in the Knesset on Wednesday. We were in the Knesset on Monday. So we were seeing people while these negotiations were happening. It was wild. It was really wild. She said she saw Yair Lapid at about noon on Wednesday, and he said he had had 25 cups of espresso and has not slept in days as he was trying to negotiate this government. So right now, where are we? The government has been formed. However, the next step is the Knesset has to vote. The 120 people have to vote. But of course, since the government is large enough, it will pass. But the chair of the Knesset, he's like Mitch McConnell. He does not want to bring it to a vote because he wants to delay the vote as long as possible so that there's a possibility for Bibi to blow this apart. The process has started. So technically he has to bring it to the floor by Monday, unless he brings it to court, which is a possibility. So the government has been formed, but it's not official until the Knesset votes. So that's what we're waiting for. And after then, if any one party leaves the government will fall. So each individual party has tremendous power, and it's a very shaky, but they're all united in wanting to get rid of Bibi Netanyahu. Next slide, and see if there are questions, Rabbi James. I'm just gonna, so this is next slide. So these are some of the key players. Down on the bottom, you see Itamar Ben-Gvir. That's the Kahanist. He's the one who went to Sheikh Jarrah and opened up an office. He's very, very, very anti-Arab, very anti-Palestinian, and he opened up an office. He's a Kahanist, which is really a form of Jewish fascism. Next slide. There he is. Okay, next slide. So these three are three to really look out for. They're real heroes of progressive Zionism. So on the far right is Nissan Horowitz, who's openly gay. And on one of our CBST trips, we met with him. Randy and I met with him last week in the Knesset. He's now the head of Meretz, which is the far left party. Meretz is kind of like the ACLU, or the Civil Rights Party of Israel. And he's the head of Meretz. And he's going to be the Minister of Health. That's an incredibly powerful and important position. And in this new government, we're going to have an openly gay man, the Minister of Health. Meirav Michaeli in the middle, who has spoken at CBST when we were at the church. Some of you might remember. She was a superstar TV journalist, very, 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 very famous before she went into politics. Feminist, very well spoken. She's against marriage. Her partner of many, many years is like the Jon Stewart of Israeli culture. He is a very famous comedian and social commentator. And he's the one who did what I thought was a pretty brilliant takedown of John Oliver's piece about the situation. He's very famous also. She's fantastic. Randy and I met with her. She's now the head of the Labor Party. She has reinvigorated what was a very dying party. And she had us meet with the Labor Party, the entire Labor Party, which I think there are 7 now in the government, and speak to them. And they have both Nitzan and Meirav, both in their lists, have a Palestinian member, Israeli Palestinian in their government. And Gilad Kariv is the first Reform rabbi. So this government has really unusual people in it. He had been the head of the Reform movement in Israel. He's Israeli born, and he is a part of the Labor Party list. And it's very, very exciting to have a progressive rabbi in Israel. If you want to know anything about the steep curve, he posted something about our visiting him. Read the comments on his social media about what a lesbian rabbi must mean and what a reform rabbi must mean to get an idea. Okay, so I think is that it on the slides, Jason? All right, good. Okay, this is the last slide. So Yair Lapid is the one I mentioned. He's the head of Yesh Atid. And in his government agreements, he put the government together, but in order to get those extra votes, he agreed that Naftali Bennett, the head of Yamina, which is a right-wing party, would join the government, and Naftali Bennett will be the prime minister for 2 years, and then Yair Lapid will become the president. Naftali Bennett, as I keep telling people when they want to know, it's kind of like Romney versus Trump. Like, of course we would, and Bibi is the equivalent of Trump, and Naftali Bennett is kind of the equivalent of Romney. He's sane. I don't agree with all of his policies. He's not a crazy person. And he really took down Netanyahu last week. Netanyahu gave a speech that sounded just like Trump. I didn't lose the election. These people are destroying our evil. They're blah, blah. You can imagine. And Naftali Bennett, to his credit, really took on Netanyahu. And the violence being threatened against Bennett now by the right wing for going into this government is so extreme that the Israeli security have had to give him the highest level of security to protect his life for even agreeing to be in a government which is now going to mean that Netanyahu is out of office. Okay, I think that's the last slide, right? Oh, this is Mansour Abbas, who is the Islamist part. Now it's the first time in Israeli history that a Palestinian is actually in the government. There have been Palestinians and Israeli Arabs in the Knesset, but this is the first time, and his party is now actually in the government. And people have said he's been saying some very impressive things. Okay, I'm going to stop and see about questions or comments, and people who also know things or want to say things. I want to also say that Judy Hollander is here, who leads our CBST Middle East and Me group, which has a wonderful and very active WhatsApp discussion group. If you would like to join it, you could send an email to Rabbi James. You have to be a CBST member to be in this group. You can send an email to rabbijames@cbst.org, and she'll make sure that you're a team player and a nice person. We're not vetting for politics. We're vetting for being able to get along with people. And it's a wonderful way for anybody who cares about these issues. Articles get posted, events get discussed, ideas get discussed. So if you're interested, write to Rabbi James if you want to be part of that group at CBST. Okay, are there any questions or comments?
We have lots
Any
of questions.
clarifications? What?
Lots of questions.
Okay.
Okay, so first, where do I even start here? What do you think is the percentage of people in Israel working on peace?
Well, what does peace mean exactly? So it's a complicated question, and I say this always to Americans who ask, what's the solution or who's doing what? If I were to ask you, what's the percentage of Americans working on racism in America, what would you say? As opposed to the question of what's the percentage of Americans who care about racism, right? How come we haven't done something about racism in America? How come racism is still such a powerful force? So I think that most Israeli Jews want peace, for sure. The issue is, what does peace look like? How is it formed? How secure are Israeli Jews in that solution? So I think most Israeli Jews want peace. I think most Palestinians want peace. When you say working on peace, what does it mean? Like, so my friend Renee Gutman, every Friday, works in a thrift shop that makes sure clothing goes to Bedouin communities, and there's all different ways people are working on it. The problem is a financial one. As I said, there are some key American Jews, namely Shelley Adelson and now his wife, Moskowitz, what's his first name? They pour billions into buying these properties, for instance, in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank, that where the fingers on the thumb. Many, many, many activists in Israel say that if American right-wing Jews were not pouring the money they were in, the situation would be very, very different, because Israeli Jews could not afford to do some of these things, that it's American Jewish money. I'll give you an example. There is a newspaper in Israel called, in Hebrew, Israel Today. It's free. People stand on the street corners handing it out to cars driving by. And it's entirely bankrolled by Shelley Adelson at a business loss every month of millions of dollars. He's not doing it. Now, the left-wing paper, which means like the paper that is not rabidly anti-Arab and not rabidly pro-Bibi, Haaretz, costs money to read. It's expensive. That's why I say, if there's one thing as an American Jew you want to do to support peace, is to support Haaretz. The English subscription is like $120 a year, and the articles are excellent. And you're supporting democracy by supporting press that can exist, besides many different organizations. But so if Shelley Adelson and his family did not pour at a loss millions of dollars a month into a newspaper that is literally approved every day by Netanyahu's people, how different would it be if that's the paper that everybody, that's really very, very, very accessible? That's kind of an example. But bottom line is, most Israeli Jews want peace. Many don't believe it's possible. There hasn't been a visionary leader in a long time who helps people get over, to a different place. Yeah. Okay, other things. Next question.
When you met with Palestinians, did they know you were gay?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are a lot of gay Palestinians, folks. It's, it's a traditional society. First of all, I wasn't in Gaza. Not Hamas would kill me, of course. But Palestinians as a people are not the religious Muslims in the world. Palestinians are also Christian. It is a traditional society. So they're grappling with a lot of issues around sexuality, gender, but it's a very, very, very educated community. I spent 7 days on a trip in the West Bank with the Palestinian gay community. And the way they described it to me was like Orthodox Jews say to me, don't come to my Orthodox synagogue and insist I fly a pride flag. I want to change my Orthodox community from the inside. And it's not going to help if you, lesbian, Reconstructionist rabbi, Sharon Kleinbaum, you come to the door of my Orthodox synagogue with a pride flag. I have to change it in my way and on my time and in my culture. The Palestinians inside of the society say the same thing. They don't want Westerners to come say, you have to fly a rainbow flag or you're self-hating. It's a traditional society. Traditional societies are changing within. Palestinians, gay Palestinians have said to me, listen, we don't talk about sex in our community. The first thing to talk about sex can't be about homosexuality. So there's a lot of work with feminist groups and with women's groups to develop conversations about sexuality, about body, about autonomy. But there is a very vibrant gay community, not just in Palestine, by the way. There was in Lebanon. There's problems in Lebanon, but it is definitely a traditional society in which the most traditional elements get power. It's not safe to be gay. That's absolutely true. But guess what? If some of these Israeli Jews were to get the government that they want in Israel to be in charge of Israel, it would not be safe to be gay in Israel either. If the Supreme Court were eliminated or eviscerated the way that Netanyahu wants to eviscerate it, Netanyahu wanted a law. Guess what the law is that Netanyahu wanted? That the Knesset, basically all the progressive things that have ever happened in Israel have come from the Supreme Court and from the judiciary, which is independent and very robust and has been very progressive. Every good law about gays, every good law about women, every good law that we think of that when we talk about how wonderful Israel is, the Knesset is largely a very conservative place because of the issues that I described before. So Netanyahu wanted a law passed that the Knesset could overrule any Supreme Court decision. So you can imagine what would happen to a Supreme Court decision, right? And if the Knesset is ruled, so I'm just saying, we have in our side of our society right now, Israel is a very the village of Tel Aviv is very different, right? And a lot of people say the 1 million people or so that live in Tel Aviv need to start using their political power differently than has been used in the past. But yes, the Palestinians, like the Palestinian businessmen that we met with, and the Palestinians in hand, absolutely. Hand in hand is dealing with gay kids in the school, by the way. I mean, guess what? They're teenagers. It's happening. It happens there.
I mean, and for the record, we just had our 10th anniversary, and one of the congratulations I got was from a friend from Gaza. So, you know, people surprise you.
Yeah.
What do you mean by a shared society? Does that mean a one-state solution?
So I'll say kind of what Ronnie said to us. I don't think Americans we always want the answer. What is the answer? We have to change the conversation on the ground. And I believe that Israelis and Palestinians will come up with what the right answer is. But the forces right now are only driving people apart. When I say shared society, I'm thinking of a society. I'm not the one who's going to determine what the political resolution is. I have my personal preferences based on my knowledge. You know, I've generally been a two-stater, believed in a two-state solution for all different reasons. But like Ronnie, I can't know what a shared society means. A society in which both peoples are sharing the society, which means there's a partnership. One is not in a position of strength over the other. And that's what shared society means to me. And I think when people are in that situation, like the Palestinian businessmen said to me, we have to have a two-state solution, because until there is a second state with that Israel has to negotiate with as an equal, we'll never be able to come up with solutions. But then after like 10 years, we want to come back together again. And maybe there'll be a confederacy. Maybe there'll be a situation, because we share the water. The aquifer is by and large underneath the West Bank. That's where the water is. That's one of the reasons that the West Bank is important to Israel. A virus knows no borders, right? And Palestinians, other than Hamas, which is not, Palestinians tend to be a much more progressive community and people. The problem is they see Hamas as their army right now. That's actually the only response to the Israeli army. That's their, that's not what my belief. I just think what we need to do, whoever we are, and I say this both whether you're on the left or the right in this conversation, we have to be able to listen to people who are saying some really different things than us. And part of the problem, like the rest of the world, everything is screaming. I mean, have you ever really sat down with a right-wing person? Have you ever really sat down with a Palestinian? Have you ever, and these things of being able to really hear. I mean, Shari and Debbie came with us. We went to this Bedouin village that many of you have come with me to, called Lakia, where there's a Bedouin women's embroidery, women's co-op, like one of these microeconomy co-ops. And to hear these women say, look, there are criminals in our society. They need to be dealt with. But all we want to do is live in peace. Shari and Debbie, don't you agree? Wasn't that so moving? She started sobbing. 10 of the children from their village are still in jail from demonstrations they went to. And she said they're high school and college kids. They're not the criminals. The criminals are, but they can't get them out of jail. This woman was just crying. This was, it was, if you've, just the ability to really hear a story like that and understand these are human beings is very powerful. Other questions or comments? And Rabbi James, if you want to say anything.
I actually was just going to say it is 7:15, and I know that you are committed to not going over. Let's hear. Yeah, are there other questions
There's
a lot of other questions, but I will say that one of the other questions was about whether we could arrange for something that would be more of a deep dive over more time. And I've got like 7 or 8 more questions. Do you want me to fling them all at you?
Can everybody stay for 15 more minutes and let's deal with the questions? Or if you can't, you can leave, but let's just see what the questions are. And sure. Shari and Debbie, if you want to say anything, since you're in Israel, we can unmute you, okay? If you do, just raise your hand. Okay, Rabbi James, what else?
Sure.
Rabbi James, if you want to answer any of these, please do, since you're also an
Yeah,
expert.
no, and I also just want to reiterate what you said at the very beginning, what Rabbi Kleinbaum said about, after a week in Israel, people want to write a book, and after a year, they, it's like you're down to a sentence maybe. And I lived there for a little over 5 years, and I can manage a Facebook post once in a while, and my wife was there for 23 years, and it's just like, I don't want to talk to anybody about this. It's hard, but it's also really important, and I will give the plug for the WhatsApp group for those of you who are members of CBST. My email is in the chat. Send me your phone number, and if you're a member, I will happily add you to that group. Okay. How do you respond to accusations of Israel doing ethnic cleansing and genocide?
Well, as I said, I think the Israeli policies starting under Ariel Sharon when he was housing minister, and under Netanyahu, they have had an interest in East Jerusalem becoming less and less Palestinian. Absolutely. So the housing policies have been designed to remove, to lower the population, and for East Jerusalem, I don't think that's going to happen, but the policies are geared towards that. My problem always is the use of the word Israel about issues, because Israel is a very complex society. And those of us who lived through Trump, we know when Trump said, advocated for the Muslim ban, didn't mean all Americans felt that way, even though it became law for a while, right? And so the same thing is true about Israel. But absolutely, there are laws in Israel, and there are under Bibi Netanyahu, and by the way, I'm not sure he has ideology that cares so much, but he needs the right wing to have stayed in power. So the settlement movement, which is a small part of Israeli society, but has an overreaching power. There are people in the settlement movement that absolutely want to get rid of Palestinians in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. That doesn't represent all of Israelis, but they have had a lot of power. And the problem in the West Bank is that it's a military occupation, which means that the laws that Palestinians who live in the West Bank are under military law, if it's Israeli territory, and as Jews who live in the West Bank are under civilian law. So the soldiers in the West Bank don't officially protect the Palestinians, they officially protect the Jews. That creates a very tense situation. And as those of you who know have been on trips with me, the West Bank is divided into different territories, and Israel has planted settlements basically along what they talk about the 5 fingers, to create a situation where the West Bank is no longer contiguous of Palestinian property or Palestinian settlements. So if you're a Palestinian and you live over here in what's officially Palestinian controlled territory, to get up to here where it used to be a quick drive that way, either you have to go through many checkpoints, or it takes forever. And if the checkpoints close down, you can't go. So virtually in the West Bank, movement is extremely restricted. And while the Palestinian Authority technically controls certain of the regions, in reality, Israel controls it. And honestly, one of the Palestinians I met with said the Palestinian police in the West Bank are capos, that they basically work for Israel in keeping the security under control, so that the Palestinians that they're basically underneath. Israel has ultimate military control, and Israel has control over even the territories that are technically Palestinian Authority, because the Palestinian Authority doesn't have a military and doesn't have. The problem for the Palestinians is that the Oslo Accords, which were signed back in the early 1990s, had confidence building measures. This ABCD structure of the West Bank was supposed to be very, very temporary. And now it's become the long-term solution, and that's impossible. And part of the confidence building measures that Israel was supposed to do was to not build any more settlements. Every Palestinian, if you go to the West Bank, every Palestinian will say that. How come Israel can't be trusted? There's no partner for peace. Everything you hear Jews say, the Palestinians will say too about Israel. There's no partner for peace. There's more, there are over, I think now over 500,000 settlers living in the West Bank. The time of Oslo, there was maybe 100,000, something like that. There was supposed to be no more. So it's a complicated question with a lot of different answers. But I think there are definitely some policies which are about removing Palestinians from certain part of the land. Not inside of Israel, but the land that's in the West Bank.
Back to the elections and the government.
Yes.
So who is the new president, and when will the vote happen that could theoretically put this new coalition government
The new president is a very interesting person who's the son and grandson of a very interesting person. His name is Itzhak Herzog, but everybody, for some reason, which I don't know, maybe Sharon, Debbie know, calls him Bougie. Does anybody know why? I have no idea. But everybody calls him by his first name. It's like Cher. Everybody just calls him Bougie. Nobody calls him by his last name. Nobody calls him. He's not yet the president. And his father was Chaim Herzog, and his grandfather was the Rabbi Herzog. He comes from a very, very, very important and interesting family. And I think he's going to be very good. I have very good feelings about him. I don't know yet, but the Knesset, I'm not sure when he actually becomes president. The new government doesn't go in until the Knesset votes. Shari and Debbie, do you know? Oh, can you unmute Shari and Debbie? They might know the answer to this. Or Rabbi James, do you know that?
I actually don't know it offhand.
Shari and Debbie?
You're unmuted.
You're unmuted.
Was the person, whoever asked that question, asking about the prime minister? Who is the prime minister, and not necessarily who is the president?
Oh, I thought they were asking about
the question was about the new president.
About the new president.
You were talking about the Knesset, so it's a very, just Rabbi, if you...
Yeah, there were two questions that were kind of connected. One was about the new president, and then one was about when does the vote happen that actually puts the new Knesset in.
Right. So the new president is Bougie Herzog. The vote happens officially. I think it has to happen by Monday, but there are other parliamentary tricks. As I said, they could not do it. And then Merav Michaeli told us that the Labor Party is already prepared to go to court because they could just not do it. Like, guess what? We know what that's like, right? Then they'd have to go to court, and then it would take probably another week or so, I think, if it goes to court, if I have the timing correct. So probably it has to happen within 2 weeks. The idea is whether Bibi would do something to torpedo this government in the time. That's the fear. And we know, since Bibi is extremely Trump-like and he's been acting extremely unhinged, I don't think it's outside of the possible.
And we know what happened to Rabin with similar types of incitement from the same person. Yes,
and there's been really a lot of violent incitement with language that really has been very similar to stuff we heard before Rabin was assassinated.
Yeah. Did LGBTQ rights come up in any of the negotiations for this partnership government? Oh, and I see Sherry and Debbie. Yes.
Do you want to talk about that, Sherry and Debbie? Well, I know that it's very visible on the Labor Party's agenda and on Meretz's agenda. It's part of their platforms, but I don't know in the negotiations themselves.
Just to mention, Rabbi, the Arab parties are objecting to that be part of the negotiation, but certainly it's part of a number of certainly for Meretz and for Labor.
Not the Arab parties, the Arab Party, Ram. Not the other ones. What?
Islamist Party, Ram.
Right, the Islamist Party objected, which is how, I don't know if you heard that I said, that's how they broke off from the Arab bloc itself. Ayman Odeh, who's the head of another one of the Arab parties, I've met with him many times, and he is very pro-gay, but he's not in the government. But he has said that if the government needs his votes, if they need his votes, that he would give them to the government. So it's like he's outside of the government, but he doesn't want, but he will support. But he's very pro-gay. And there are Arab members of Avodah, and there are Arab members of Meretz. Both of those parties, which have very strong pro-gay platforms. Meretz is the chair of the party is gay himself, and both of those parties have Arab members of those parties, and they're certainly, obviously, fine with the gay stuff. Okay, next we'll take one or two more.
Are we ignoring deep hate towards Jews? I worry about Israel because of generations of hate.
Well, that's why I started out by talking about anti-Semitism, and people who've heard me over the years know that I talk about Jew hatred being a part of the DNA of the world, and I don't ignore that at all. Jew hatred is part of the world, it's part of America, it's part of Europe, it's part of the world, absolutely. So I'm not ignoring it. I just feel like as a Jew, I want Jews to act in the world the way that I'm proud of, but with the deepest Jewish values I have. And I think and you've heard me say this a gazillion times, I think the strongest reaction to anti-Semitism is to be more Jewish and to learn more and to act in Jewishly meaningful and valued on Jewish values way. I don't think, honestly, and if you've heard me talk about this over the years, and many generals in Israel agree with me on this, the greatest existential threat to Israel is not solving the conflict with the Palestinians, because it's tearing apart the soul of Israel from the inside, and it's threatening the inside of Israel. In a way, Israel is a great military power. I think Israel can really protect itself from military threats from the outside. But this is really destroying Israel on the inside. And without that resolved, so on a very practical level, I think that a deep and fair and just resolution ensures the future of the state of Israel. I have a lot of fear for Israel if it doesn't. I mean, the hatred, when you've met Palestinians whose only experience with Israelis is soldiers who they've watched pat down in humiliating ways their grandmother, and that's literally their experience with Jews. They've grown up, I mean, since 1967 now, there are 2 million Palestinians on the West Bank who pretty much only know Jews because Jews have been the police, the military has been the police force, which has often treated them with great humiliation. They hate Israel. It's not only crazy, it's not only anti-Semitic. I mean, I think we have to be willing to understand and be willing to separate out. There's Jew hatred in the world for sure. But if you watch the way that Palestinians are treated on the West Bank, do you think you would really be any different? I don't think so. And unless this is resolved, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or does it explode? How long? 50 years. How long has the occupation of the West Bank been? How many years is that? How many generations of children are growing up seeing Israel as a bunch of soldiers with guns who come into their houses at 2 o'clock in the morning, take out the entire family out to stand in the street, rough up the house, turn things over, make the kids stand outside till 3 o'clock in the morning at gunpoint, then take a couple down to the police station? That's a regular occurrence on the West Bank. Not Israeli Arabs inside of Israel. It's a whole issue. But on the West Bank, how can they feel differently? How are we going to change that relationship? We can't just say it's Jew hatred. We have to be able to say there is Jew hatred, but also Jews are acting in a way that a military occupier of a civilian population act, and the civilian population responds. They start terrorist groups, they start reacting with hatred, they start doing whatever they can to have some respect in their lives. And until that's resolved, that will always be a time bomb waiting to blow up. You cannot occupy 2 million people and then think that's going to work out okay just by, and that's what Bibi has talked about. Just, it's called mowing the lawn. Every few years there'll be an action. Up here, somebody telling us why bougie is called bougie.
I was just going to say.
He was given the name by his Egyptian-born French-speaking mother, who combined the French word for doll, poopy, with the Hebrew equivalent booba. But he prefers to be called Isaac when speaking with English speakers or foreigners, not its Hebrew name, Yitzchak. Interesting. See that? I never knew that.
We all learned something.
All right, friends, I think we're at 7:30. And so Rabbi James, you've collected it. Thank you all for your interest and your openness. And it's not easy. And I'll let you know when our next trip to Israel is happening, but it was very, very moving to be there. Wonderful to see Shari and Debbie. They came, we spent a day together, and then we did a drink together with CBSTers one night. So blessings to everybody. Rabbi James, you want to end us with a prayer for peace of some kind?
Oh, yeah, I would love to end with, there was a prayer that was written called the Prayer of the Mothers by a rabbi in Jerusalem, Tamar Elad Applebaum. And
I went to shul at her synagogue.
yeah, and a Muslim colleague of hers, Sheikha Ibtisam Mahamid, so a woman sheikh and a woman rabbi, both relatively unusual in the land that we're hoping will one day be holy. And during an earlier time of trouble, they wrote this blessing together called the Prayer of the Mothers for Life and Peace. God of life, who heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds, may it be your will to hear the prayer of the mothers, for you did not create us to kill each other nor to live in fear, anger, or hatred in your world, but rather you've created us so we can grant permission to one another to sanctify your name of life, your name of peace in this world. I'm just skipping to the end. We shall write our lives in the book of life. For your sake, God of life, let us choose life. For you are peace, and your world is peace, and all that is yours is peace. And so shall be your will, and let us say, Amen.
Amen. May it be so. Thank you, everybody. Let's continue the conversation and the discussion and keep learning new things and keep paying attention. It's important. Wonderful to see everybody. Good night.
Amen.